Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I did this drawing of a Blue Staffordshire Bull Terrier in pastels. Now the first thing that I like to work on is the eye, and I don't really work on both eyes at the same time. I'll usually work here on the left side and then progress across to the right. Just because I'm right-handed, it prevents me from then leaning over any other part of my drawing. Now when it comes to working on the fur, I've got two methods that I like to use for my base layer. The first is using pastel pencils straight from that first layer all the way up to the final details, or for this portrait I decided to use my pan pastels, get a thin layer of pastel down where I can then achieve a nice soft smooth blended layer and then go back on top with my pastel pencils. Now the pan pastels, for that very first base layer, they work great, but we do have to be very aware of how much of that pastel we're applying to the surface. If we do add too much, we're going to fill the tooth of the paper and we won't then be able to layer our details on top. So that was obviously going to then limit how much realism, the depth that we can achieve in the finished portrait. So as I continue to build up my layers here, you can see that I am predominantly working with dark to light techniques. The one thing that I have done here though is with the pan pastel base layer is I haven't really added in too much of my darker pigment. I'm adding that in with my pastel pencils, and then once that's in place I'm working with my lighter layers. Now the other thing is, like with all of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll see that I do break it up into small manageable chunks. So once I'd got this part of the face in and I was happy with the level of detail, I then moved on to the ear and the top section of her head. Now I like to work in this way because I feel I don't skip on the important stages. The layering process is important when drawing fur. If we don't have the right number of layers or we do skip through certain stages, the end result of that portrait is going to be far flatter and two-dimensional. So I just like to break that up into 1 or 2 square inches at a time, get that to about 80-90% complete, and then I can always add the final touches once all of the portrait is drawn in. Now I also feel that if you do sit there staring at your reference photo thinking where do I start, that's a good indication that we're focusing on too much of a larger area. So even if you need to, just focus on that one tiny little bit of the eyebrow, the one section of the ear, and then slowly it will all come together. But by working in that way, it prevents us from becoming overwhelmed throughout that drawing process. Now as I continue to build up the shape of the top of her head here, it's really noticeable how careful I am in placing my shadows and my highlights. This is something I talk about in all of my videos because the highlights and shadows are not random. They do follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now given the structure of a Staffordshire Bull Terrier's skull, they've got a very predominant skull shape. So the way that the highlights and shadows are curving here are more unique to that breed. So we're going to have this shine on most dogs because obviously the shape of that skull, you've got the top of the eye socket. But with the Staffordshire Bull Terrier, you're going to have potentially some more muscle underneath the skin that's going to make those shadows and highlights more curved. So I do really want to pay very close attention to the direction of that fur. You can see here that even at that base layer stage, it looks like it's curving over a structure. I haven't put one solid colour down. And that's going to help to build up the shape of the face and hint already at that three-dimensional look. As I now continue with my subtle layers building up with my pastel pencils, you can see now that it's really reinforcing that first base layer stage. Now I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. Now I talk about a few things in that video, but one of them is pencil technique. Now this focuses predominantly on the fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. So as I'm now building up the details and we've got more of the face drawn in, you can really see how that fur direction is curving. It goes over the top of her eye sockets and then it comes over down towards her skull and then where her ears have joined onto the side of her face. This there is very important. If I don't get the angle and curve of the pencil strokes right, I'm going to completely change the way that the dog looks. So if I make my pencil strokes too straight and too vertical, the face is going to look very narrow. If I then overcompensate and make them too flat and horizontal, the face is going to look really wide. Now this is something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time tutorials on Patreon. Because I now draw all of my tutorials for Patreon with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm able to explain every decision and all of those processes in the moment. Now when it comes to the fur direction, just like when I mentioned earlier on in this video with mapping in the lights and the darks accurately, The fur direction is going to play a very important role in what that portrait looks like when finished and how closely it resembles that pet. So the fur direction is something that's just as important as anything else. Now, along with that, when it comes to working on the nose and around the bridge of the nose, this here, the fur length is significantly shorter on this breed. Now, obviously, if you've got something like a Cockapoo, they do have quite long fur around the nose as well. But with Labradors, Staffordshire Bull Terriers, Rottweilers, all of those breeds, the shorter fur around the nose needs to be replicated in that way in order to get the texture right. So if I was to keep the pencil strokes the same length on the nose area as to, like for instance, the top of her head, it's going to make the area around her nose look too fluffy, even if it is only by 2 or 3 millimeters. So it's just about noticing in that reference photo where that fur looks a little bit shorter. Even if it is only by a couple of millimeters, it is something there that we want to get variation in our pencil strokes. Now, as I come to this side of the face, look at how the position of the lights and the darks, the highlights and the shadows, are also coinciding with the fur direction. So where it curves over, you've got that highlight and the shadow. All of this here plays such an important role in building up the shape of the face. It's not one element that's more important than the other. So we do want to be making sure that we are always reinforcing the contrast, and I speak about this in all tutorials. So that is how light your highlights are and how dark your shadows are. That there is going to help to build up more of that three-dimensional look in the portrait. Now, one of the questions that I'm asked is, how do you know which pastel pencils to select in terms of which colour we should be using? Now, I do have a giraffe tutorial on Patreon that focuses on how to pick colours from a reference photo and how we then layer those colours in that giraffe drawing. So if that's of interest, I'll link my Patreon in the description below. But really, when it comes to colour selection, I don't use any complex colour theory. It really does just depend on where that colour sits on the colour wheel. Is it a warm colour or is it a cool colour? Now, for instance, with this sort of portrait, it's pretty much on the warmer end. It's more of those neutral, warmer greys. We've got a few of those reddish, purpley brown colours around her eyes. And this here is going to help to build up the shape. But it's how dark or how light that colour is. So for instance, underneath the eye, you've got that slightly dark reddish purple colour, and then you've got a lower highlight, those small flecks of hairs underneath the eye. Those lights and darks are what's going to build up the shape. It's not what the exact colour is, it's whether or not it's a dark or light version of that colour. Now, another thing in terms of colour selection is, let's say this dog was photographed out in sunlight. The colour's going to be very different on her fur to what it is on this photograph, which was taken indoors. So therefore the lighting's a little bit more muted. Her colour there is going to reflect on some of the surroundings as well. So if she was photographed outside and it was a sunny day, you can have more of the blue from the sky reflecting in this sort of coat colour. So there I'd probably be using more ultramarine blues and some pale sky blues as well in some of the shinier sections of her fur. Whereas for this, I'm using more of my lighter greys. And what's important about that is, regardless of the colour of the fur, depending on where that photograph was taken, it would still look like that dog because the contrast is right, the darks and the light. Now, I think when drawing breeds like this that do have more of a muscle and structure to the face, the importance of the position of the highlights and shadows becomes more prominent. You can really see here where her eye socket is, the cheekbone, the side of her jaw, all of that there is decided from where those highlights and shadows are positioned. Now, I know I have focused on this thoroughly throughout this tutorial, but it really is one of those things that's going to make such a difference to how realistic the finished portrait will be. Now onto the neck and chest of this portrait, I'm going to carry on using my pan pastels to get a nice smooth blended base layer in here, and then continue to layer my lighter layers on top. So the technique that I'm using is the same from what I was doing on the face, however I've made sure that I haven't made my base layer too dark. When drawing white fur, if you make the base layer too dark, it can be trickier to get that back up to the lighter layer that we can see in that reference photo. So I do sometimes like to err on the side of caution, and I can always darken it up in stages later on if I need to. Now, one thing I want to mention about this section is the collar. Now, when I'm drawing collars or harnesses, if the fur is overlapping any part of that collar, I will leave the collar more for the last stages. Now the reason being, if I was to work on all of the detail on the top part of the neck that overlaps the collar, I'm going to have to draw around all of those hairs when I come to work on the collar later. Whereas when I block the collar in, I can then add all of those hairs over the top. It's going to be quicker, much easier, and it'll be more realistic because it will then push the collar back and bring the top part of the neck forward. So no matter what it is that I'm drawing, it doesn't have to be a collar, it can also be areas of the fur. If I notice a section of fur that's overlapping something else, I will draw what's underneath it first. And there are a wide range of subjects where that's going to vary depending on the fur texture. So I do have a Patreon library on my website which lists all of the tutorials that I have available on Patreon. There are many different subjects there, a range of wildlife animals to domestic pets. So there is tutorials there for maybe artists who want to start taking on commissions of their own, or if you've just got a genuine interest in drawing. The wildlife subjects there really do cover a range of techniques. So if you would like to see the list of tutorials that I've got on Patreon, then I will link that in the description below as well. Now you can really see there what I was mentioning about the collar, how I've added in all of those tiny little white hairs on top. That's brought that section of the neck forward. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel and I'd be really, really grateful. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the end of the week. I do upload 2 to 3 videos each week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching.